Welcome to the Commercial Property Podcast. My name is Suzi Carter. I am a chartered surveyor. I've been involved in commercial property in the UK for 30 years and I've done hundreds of commercial property deals. I'm here to be your guide through the commercial property market, whether you're an experienced investor or whether you're literally thinking about dipping your toe in the world of commercial real estate. I will be here talking to you about all kinds of things commercial real estate in the UK, and I've also got some fantastic guest experts who are joining me. So please do subscribe if you'd like to follow, and if you'd like any more help or information on commercial real estate, please do click www.suzicarter.com, which is my website, and you can find out all the ways I can help you. So stay tuned for this week's episode. Welcome back to the Commercial Property Podcast, and today we're talking about commercial tenants and rent arrears. And for residential investors, that kind of strikes the fear of God into them, because there are obviously a lot of rights for residential tenants, and if you want to recover the arrears for residential properties from residential tenants, you have to go through a very long and convoluted court process very often. In commercial, late rent isn't emotional, it's just contractual. And I'm going to explain to you today a step-by-step process as to how to understand commercial rent arrears without the legal jargon. So a really common sense, practical approach to late rent. And commercial property is designed for business, not drama. So, and one of the things that's going to protect you the most is your lease. So it's all about the contract and your rights within the contract. So negotiate a great lease, negotiate a great contract. You don't need to worry as much, but I'm going to take you through that. So first of all, let's kind of concentrate on why residential investors may fear rent arrears so much. You know, late payment of rent, tenant stops paying. It is absolutely understandable that there's issues with it, because you have to issue notices, and of course the whole process is going to get a whole lot more complicated with the rental reform bill coming into power, because Section 21s are going to be abolished. What that means is that you can't get rid of residential tenants. Section 8s can still be served, so if they don't pay their rent, you can still very much serve a notice. But it's likely that there's still going to be the court backlogs that we're seeing at the moment, court delays, limited control, long notice periods, etc. And I think when residential investors start to look at commercial, there is a similar fear there that perhaps is going to be the same. But genuinely, commercial rent arrears need to be looked at in a completely different way. So I'm going to talk to you kind of about how you do that. And you're not wrong to worry about commercial arrears. You're just using the wrong rule book. So in commercial, there's a much very different rule book that you need to look at. So what does non-payment usually look like in commercial? Well, very often what it isn't, now obviously sometimes it can be, but very often what it isn't is that there's a guillotine come down and the tenant never pays rent again. Usually, or the tenant disappears overnight. That sometimes that does happen, but I would say it's in the rarer of cases. Common scenarios are, bearing in mind we're dealing with businesses, so common scenarios are late payments due to cash flow timing. That's especially if you've got rents quarterly in advance, because obviously they're paying a quarter's rent up front then. In advance of the months that they're paying that rent for. This is why a lot of monthly rents have been introduced, because it just helps tenants' cash flow, especially SME type tenants. It just helps their cash flow. Short-term business disruption might be an effect, time of the year, the supply chain, something happening, maybe even with retail, something as simple as roadworks outside can really affect business and really affect turnover. Might be the illness of the owner if it's an SME business, negotiation or payment plans. So it might be that a tenant, they can't pay, but they might want to go onto a payment plan. And commercial tenants are simply businesses protecting their premises. So obviously cash flow is king. And so, or queen. So if they are, they're struggling to pay the rent, what very often what tenants don't do is come and talk to you first. Sometimes they do, and obviously it's great to build relationships with your tenants where they feel they can come and have those conversations. And, just by way of an aside, a lot of landlords don't really interact with their tenants, especially if you've got full repairing and insuring leases. They don't really interact with their tenants at any other time other than maybe when there's a confrontational relationship like rent reviews or lease renewals or new lettings even, where it's kind of landlord against tenant. It's actually, in this day and age, when you're building landlord and tenant relationships, it's actually much better to interact throughout the term of the lease. Speak to a tenant when you haven't got a rent review to do or a lease renewal to do, because you can build up a relationship much easier. And ultimately, commercial tenants will be protecting their cash flow. So if you think about what commercial tenants have to do, they've got to pay their suppliers, they've got to pay their staff, they've got to pay their energy bills, they've got to pay their rates. There's all manner of things that a commercial tenant needs to pay other than rent. So most issues with late rent payments or non-payment of rent need to first start with a discussion with your commercial tenant, because it might be that they've just got a short-term cash flow issue and therefore all that they want to do is have some form of payment plan. So say they're on quarterly in advance type rent payments, they might ask to be put on monthly payments. Now, obviously it's up to you as to whether you choose to grant them that right, but sometimes just easing cash flow can just take the problem away straight away. But in a commercial lease, there are lots and lots of checks and balances that help you as the landlord protect yourself against some of these scenarios arising. And a lease is a business contract, not a tenancy agreement. That's the big difference between residential and commercial. So, rent is stipulated when it's to be paid. If they pay late, there's interest payments that need to be paid. Also, you can put service charge and insurance, and you can do something called reserve them as rent. What that means is that if they're also late in paying service charge and insurance, you've still got the same rights as you have if they're late in paying their rent. So, a good solicitor will be able to advise you in all this kind of stuff. The legal rights are clearly defined, and particularly in a lease, the right of entry. So if there's arrears, if the property's in disrepair, then very often the landlord, as long as the lease is drafted correctly, and this is the big if, they have the right to enter the premises and remediate. So, for example, if the property is in poor repair, you can go in and do a dilapidation schedule and demand that the tenant brings the property up to the right state of repair. If there's non-payment of rent, and I'm not suggesting this is the first step that you need to follow, you can go into the property and you can send bailiffs in, and they can change the locks, they can hold the goods in the property against any late payments or non-payments. Now, the tenant has a right to appeal that or remediate that by paying the rent, but ultimately that's what you want. You want them to pay the rent to you. So you do have this right, as long as there's a right of entry and a right to forfeit the lease, you do have a right to send bailiffs in. It's a very well-worn path with bailiffs to go in and do this and to change the locks and seize the goods in the property. So you've got these remedial measures that you just don't have in the residential world. But, and here's the big thing, it's all down to how well your lease is drafted. So we'll talk in a minute about kind of some of the checks and balances you can put in place to ensure that your tenant always pays the rent on time, because that's ultimately what we all want as investors. But if you do have these problems, and ultimately, issues do arise from time to time, then a lease, the lease and the correct drafting of the lease will make sure that you have the remedial measures to correct this. So what can you do practically to resolve some of these issues? Well, first of all, as I say, you want to make sure that if you possibly can, you've got a relationship with your tenants that falls outside kind of confrontational moments in the lease. So, especially with SME businesses, it's much easier to build these relationships. With brands, it's a bit harder. But, just checking in, how's everything going and how's trade? Everything all right at the property? Have a cup of tea with them, whatever else it might be. If you have that kind of relationship, or even if you don't, the first thing you do if your tenant doesn't pay the rent is, I'm sure it's a mistake, but can you please now pay your rent? I'm sure it's an oversight. I'm sure it's a mistake, but please can you now pay your rent? So it's, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Very quickly, of course, especially if you have radio silence, and if any tenants are listening here, I would strongly recommend that if you do have any cash flow issues, you absolutely communicate with your landlord first. You don't kind of put your head in the sand and hope it'll go away, because landlords can escalate activity really, really quickly. So you want to make sure that you're communicating with your landlords, and landlords, you want to make sure that you're communicating with your tenants. So if they, I'm sure that everything's, pick the phone up, I'm sure that everything's fine, but I expect to get the rent, then you can send a formal letter, whether that's a letter from your organisation or a solicitor's letter, basically then serving a formal notice. Then you want to look at rent recovery options, whether it's sending a bailiff in. You might agree a payment plan with tenants, so I'm having a short-term cash flow issue. Is it okay if I pay monthly for the next 3 months until I get myself back on the feet? Now, you want to monitor that very, very carefully, because things can go sideways very quickly in my experience. So absolutely look at payment plans, maybe looking as a landlord to see whether you can get any advantage out of that. Maybe, inserting a landlord's break clause in the lease or something like that. Never shy away from an opportunity to, strengthen your position. But ultimately, for good landlord and tenant relationships, you may just simply want to try to just ease the pressure on your tenant, because ultimately you want them to be there for the medium term or long term. And so just a bit of short-term pressure, you're going to work with them, and that will kind of definitely cement that relationship as well. But obviously don't be taken for granted, because you do usually have these remedial measures that you've got in leases where you can escalate this very quickly. So at some point you'll need to get your solicitor involved if it keeps escalating, or ideally get a bailiff involved to go and change the locks if you need to. But the action is clearer and much faster than in residential. You don't need to wait for courts. You don't need to wait for kind of legal timeframes. So speak to your solicitor about the different options. But commercial landlords, as a general rule, aren't powerless. They are protected, and they're protected by their lease. So who's got the control? If we compare residential and commercial, who's got the control? Well, in residential, there's heavy regulation. There's a tenant first framework in the regulation as well. In commercial, it's contract led, it's business to business. They're big boys and girls that can look after themselves. And risk is ultimately priced into the deal in the form of the yield. So, if you've got a relatively risky tenant on a short lease, then that's going to be reflected in the price you pay, or at least it should be. So commercial risk is visible and manageable. Residential risk is hidden and now ultimately much more political than it ever was. So what's the real risk in commercial property? And it's not late rent. I'm telling you for now, answers on a postcard. What is the real risk? The real risk is not doing your checks and balances on, firstly, your tenant, and secondly, putting the right lease in place. That is the real risk in commercial property. Ultimately as well, not buying in the right location where you could potentially relet the property. There is nothing worse than that feeling when you have to play ball with a tenant because there's nobody else out there who would take the property. You don't want to be in that position. You want to be in a position where you could relet the property and get another tenant in if you had to. But the real risks are poor tenant due diligence, not doing due diligence on your tenant, not looking at their covenant, not looking at their accounts, not Googling them, not getting the right guarantees in place or guarantors. If it's a startup or a small one-man or one-woman band, getting a personal guarantee in place, which I would highly recommend. Not getting rent deposits in place. that is a big problem. That is where the real risk lies. Also, in terms of weak lease terms, if you've got to always use a commercial solicitor, always use a good commercial solicitor, because ultimately it's worth spending a bit more on a commercial lease to know that you're protected throughout the term. And I quite often get questions from clients and non-clients saying, oh, this solicitor wants to charge me £7,000 for the lease. I might just get one off the internet. I would say absolutely do not do that. You want to make sure that you have a lease that a solicitor has gone through that is fit for purpose on that property. And you want to make sure that it's absolutely got all the bells and whistles that you need in there to protect you from any of the risks that were talked about today. And I suppose the third risk is buying the wrong property in the wrong location, because as I said earlier, you're not able to, you're kind of scraping the barrel in terms of the type of tenant you need, the type of lease you're going to get, and also the ability to re-let the property as well is really affected by buying the wrong property in the wrong location. So late rent is a symptom, not the disease. Upstream, you can protect yourself a lot more by buying the right property, finding the right tenant, and putting the right lease in place. It's kind of like the holy trinity of what you want to look for. So you want to reduce any of this risk before you buy the property. So you need to check the tenant covenant strength. You need to make sure that you're putting the right lease length and terms in place. You want to make sure that break clause are put in place if you need to.
This episode is brought to you by Bond Finance Limited, your trusted partner for commercial property mortgage solutions. Are you an experienced residential property investor about to diversify into commercial property, looking for funding options? Bond Finance can help. Whether you're planning to expand, refinance, or make a major property investment, Bond Finance provides expert advice with access to a wide range of lenders, from high street to specialist. Book a free discovery session today to explore how we can tailor commercial funding solutions to your unique investment strategy. Visit www.bondfinanceltd.co.uk and take the next step in your commercial finance journey.
Rent review structure is correct. You don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to understand the practical implications of not getting this stuff in place, and then ask the right questions of your solicitor and make sure that you absolutely understand it. And I work with my clients a lot on working with leases they're putting in place for tenants, because ultimately, that there's a practical element to this as well as a legal element. You want to make sure that it works practically. So once you understand how commercial works, the fear disappears and clarity replaces it. And you have a lot more control as a commercial landlord than you do as a residential landlord. So, the risk is understandable, but it's manageable and is often a lot lower than in the residential world, as long as you get these fundamentals of property in the right location, tenant and lease in place right up front. So, this is how we can protect ourselves before we've even let the property against rent arrears and late payment of rent, because ultimately it's all down to the contract in commercial property. So it's nothing to fear. That you will, if you build a portfolio big enough, get cases where there is non-payment of rent, late payment of rent. And as long as you follow the practical steps in this podcast, you should be okay. Ultimately, protecting yourself by buying the right property in the right location, making the right decisions on a tenant and doing the right checks and balances, and putting the right lease in place with the right clauses, which mean that you can move on quickly if a tenant is consistently and persistently not paying their rent, or you've got some teeth if you need to against a tenant. So hopefully this was useful today. A very, very practical session. Nothing to be feared, but definitely something to be dealt with upstream rather than reacted to in the moment. So I'll see you next time on the Commercial Property Podcast.